My name is Emily Garcia, and I am 26 years old. I woke up in an Anchorage hospital room after spending 12 days in a coma. My family did not hold my hand while I was under. They visited on the second day, checked my insurance status, and vanished. 5 days after I finally opened my eyes, they marched back into the hospital ward. My father stood at the front desk and demanded to know why I had not been discharged yet. The charge nurse looked at him with pure disdain. She delivered a single sentence that left my father, my mother, and my older sister standing frozen in shock. Before I tell you what that nurse said and how my family lost the millions they thought they were entitled to, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Only do it if you genuinely enjoy this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to the cold room where I first opened my eyes. The first thing I registered was the steady beep of a heart monitor. Then came the smell of bleach and sterile cotton. I tried to move my arm, but a sharp pain shot up my shoulder, pinning me to the mattress. My throat felt like sandpaper. I blinked against the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to piece together how I got there. Memory returned in jagged fragments. Black ice on the Glen Highway, the sickening crunch of metal, the windshield shattering inward. A nurse walked in her scrubs, a soft blue against the stark white walls. She stopped dead when she saw my open eyes. She hit a button on the wall and rushed to my side. "You are awake," she said, her voice gentle but trembling slightly. "Emily, do not try to sit up. You have been in a medically induced coma for nearly 2 weeks." I tried to speak, but the sound came out as a harsh croak. "Water," I rasped. She helped me sip from a small cup with a straw. Once my throat cleared enough to form actual words, I asked the only question that mattered. "Where are my parents?" The nurse, whose name tag read Claire, hesitated. She looked away, adjusting my IV drip. The silence stretched out thick and uncomfortable. "Are they hurt?" I asked, panic rising in my chest. "Were they in the crash?" "No," Claire said softly. "They are fine. They were not with you." "Then why are they not here?" Claire pressed her lips together. She looked at me with a profound, quiet pity that made my stomach drop. She pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. "They came on the second day," she explained. "They spoke with the billing department. Once they realized your insurance policy had low limits, they said they needed to go home to figure things out. We have tried calling them every day to update them on your condition. They stopped answering the phone a week ago." I stared at the ceiling. The words did not make sense. I am a wildlife rehabilitator. I spend my days working in the freezing Alaskan wind, rescuing injured eagles and keeping them warm. I have dedicated my life to nursing broken things back to health. I assumed that if I ever broke, my family would do the same for me. My parents, David and Susan, live in a pristine neighborhood on the south side of town. They host lavish dinner parties. They pride themselves on appearances and golf club memberships. My older sister, Jessica, runs a failing high-end boutique that my parents constantly fund. They always viewed my job at the sanctuary as a naive hobby, but I never thought they would simply discard me. "Can I have my phone?" I asked. Claire nodded. She pulled my cracked phone from a plastic belongings bag and plugged it into the wall. It powered on. I had 72 unread messages. I opened the thread with my mother. I expected to find frantic questions. I expected to read desperate prayers for me to wake up. Instead, I found a cold, calculated string of complaints. From my mother, sent on day 3. "The parking structure at the hospital is $20 a day. We cannot keep coming down here just to stare at you sleeping." From my father, sent on day 5. "The financial counselor said your bills are already in the tens of thousands. You know Jessica and Brad are struggling right now. We cannot afford to be dragged down by this." From my sister Jessica, sent on day 7. "Mom is a wreck. It is really selfish of you to put us through this stress right before Brad's big investor meeting. Not a single text asked if I was going to survive." I locked the screen and set the phone on the tray table. The physical pain in my shattered ribs was nothing compared to the hollow ache in my chest. My family had done the math. They weighed the cost of my medical care against their comfortable lifestyle and decided I was too expensive to love. I did not cry. Crying requires energy I did not possess. I just lay there and let the truth harden inside me. They chose their country club dues and Brad's fake luxury lifestyle over their own flesh and blood. Claire placed a warm hand on my arm. She had seen families fall apart in waiting rooms before, but the calculated abandonment of a child in a coma was a new level of cruelty. "We will take good care of you here, Emily," she said quietly. "I know," I whispered. For the next 4 days, I stared at the blank walls of my hospital room. The physical therapy was agonizing. I learned to sit up to bear weight on my legs, to breathe without sharp pain tearing through my chest. And in that quiet, sterile room, the girl who always forgave her parents died. A new version of me took her place. I stopped hoping the door would open and my mother would walk in with a bouquet of flowers. I stopped wishing for my father to hold my hand and tell me everything was going to be okay. The silence from their side of the city was deafening. They had written me off. They assumed my life was a lost cause and my bank account was empty. They had no idea that my grandfather Thomas, the only person in the family who ever truly saw me, had left behind a secret. And they had no idea that while they were busy abandoning me, a woman in a tailored suit was walking through the hospital doors with a leather briefcase that was about to turn their entire world upside down. The next 4 days in the step-down unit blurred into a grueling cycle of physical therapy and sterile silence. Every breath I took felt like inhaling broken glass. My ribs were bruised in shades of deep purple and yellow, and my left leg was encased in a heavy brace. The nurses forced me to stand twice a day. I gripped the aluminum frame of a walker until my knuckles turned white, dragging my injured leg across the cold linoleum floor of the hospital corridor. Each step was a battle. I focused entirely on the square ceiling tiles, counting them to distract myself from the agonizing pain radiating up my spine. During those long, empty hours, I had nothing but time to think. I reached for my phone on the third afternoon. I had already read the cold text messages my parents sent while I was unconscious. I knew they had walked away. But a part of me, the naive daughter they always mocked, still wondered what they were doing instead of sitting by my hospital bed. I opened a social media app. The algorithm immediately populated my feed with recent posts from my sister Jessica. The screen illuminated with a high-resolution photograph taken just 2 nights ago. My mother, my father Jessica, and her husband Brad were standing together in the grand ballroom of the Captain Cook Hotel in downtown Anchorage. It was a charity gala for a local business association. My mother wore a bespoke emerald dress. My father was in a tailored tuxedo. Jessica was holding a crystal champagne flute, leaning against Brad, who was wearing a watch that cost more than my annual salary at the wildlife sanctuary. The caption below the photo read, "Family is everything. Blessed to spend the evening with my rocks." I stared at the image until the screen blurred. They posted that photo while I was breathing through a ventilator across town. Our family dynamic had always been an open secret, but seeing it documented on a glowing screen made it undeniable. David and Susan Garcia did not value loyalty. They valued proximity to power and the illusion of wealth. They spent decades clawing their way into the upper middle-class circles of Anchorage, desperate to be recognized by the local elite. Jessica was their golden investment. She owned a high-end outerwear boutique in a prime retail district. The store featured velvet seating areas, imported wool coats, and complimentary espresso for clients. What the socialites of Anchorage did not know was that Jessica possessed zero business acumen. The boutique operated at a staggering loss every single quarter. My parents quietly funneled thousands of dollars into her business account just to keep the doors open and preserve the image of their successful daughter. Then there was Brad. Brad called himself a luxury real estate developer. In reality, he was a speculator who funded his lavish lifestyle through high-interest loans and the financial backing of his wealthy in-laws. My parents drained their own liquidity to finance Brad and Jessica, treating them like a country club membership they had to renew every month. I was the opposite. I wore insulated boots and flannel shirts. I spent my mornings breaking ice off the water troughs at the Raptor Center and my afternoons feeding orphaned bald eagles. My parents viewed my career in wildlife rehabilitation as an embarrassment. They thought my lack of interest in designer brands and networking events meant I was simple-minded. They treated my empathy as a defect. I locked my phone and set it face down on the rolling tray table. The physical pain in my chest was suddenly eclipsed by a cold, searing clarity. I had spent my entire adult life trying to earn the respect of people who only measured worth by a bank balance. The door to my room opened, pulling me out of my thoughts. A woman walked in carrying a thick manila folder. She wore a sensible gray sweater and a name badge that identified her as Helen, the hospital social worker. Her expression was polite, but tightly controlled the face of someone who delivered bad news for a living. "Good afternoon, Emily," she said. "I know you are still recovering, but we need to discuss your discharge plan and your billing status." I nodded and adjusted my posture against the pillows. Helen pulled a chair to the side of my bed and opened the folder. "I need to be transparent with you," she began. "The emergency medical helicopter transport from the icy highway alone cost $40,000. Your emergency trauma surgery, the 12 days in the intensive care unit, and the ongoing physical therapy have generated a balance exceeding $200,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. My health insurance was a basic policy provided by the nonprofit sanctuary. It had a low maximum payout limit for catastrophic events. "My insurance will not cover all of that," I said. My voice sounded thin and fragile in the quiet room. "I know," Helen said softly. "That is why I wanted to speak with your family. We normally arrange payment plans or seek secondary guarantors for patients facing extreme medical debt." She turned a page in her folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper covered in dense legal text. She handed it to me. "When your parents visited on your second day here, our financial department approached them. We asked if they would be willing to co-sign a financial responsibility form to ensure your continued care once your insurance benefits were exhausted." I looked down at the paper. At the bottom of the page on the line marked "Guarantor signature declined" were the bold, unmistakable signatures of David and Susan Garcia. They did not just leave because they were uncomfortable. They left because they wanted to legally insulate their assets from my tragedy. They formally severed their financial ties to me while I was fighting for my life in a coma. They made a calculated legal decision to protect Jessica's failing boutique and Brad's leased luxury vehicles over my survival. "They signed this and then went to a gala," I whispered. Helen looked down at her hands. "I am very sorry, Emily. We will not deny you care, but the billing department will eventually send the remaining balance to collections. We also need an address for your discharge next week. You cannot navigate stairs with your leg brace, and you cannot live alone right now." I handed the paper back to her. My apartment was a third-floor walk-up. I had no savings. I had no family willing to take me in. I was trapped in a financial and physical nightmare designed by the American healthcare system and perfected by my own parents. The grief that had been choking me for days simply evaporated. Sadness is a heavy emotion. It weighs you down and makes you tired. But anger is a clean, burning fuel. I realized in that moment that being the soft, forgiving daughter had only made me easy prey. I had let them treat me like an afterthought for 26 years. I let them call me naive. I let them dismiss my life choices while they funded a kingdom of lies. I looked out the hospital window at the jagged snow-covered peaks of the Chugach Mountains in the distance. The Alaskan wilderness is unforgiving. It does not tolerate weakness. The animals I rehabilitated survived because they adapted to the cold. It was time for me to do the same. "I will figure out the living situation," I told Helen. My voice did not shake. "I will handle the bills." Helen gave me a sympathetic nod, closing her folder. "I will give you some time to process this. Let my office know if you think of any friends or extended relatives we can contact." She stood up and walked toward the door. Just as her hand touched the handle, someone knocked from the other side. Helen opened the door and stepped back. A woman stood in the hallway. She did not look like a doctor, and she certainly did not look like hospital administration. She wore a tailored black wool coat over a pristine charcoal suit. Her dark hair was pulled into a sharp, immaculate twist. She held a thick leather briefcase in her right hand. Her eyes swept the room with the precision of a predator before locking onto me. "Emily Garcia," the woman said. Her tone was not a question. It was a statement of fact. I pulled myself upright against the pillows, ignoring the sharp protest of my ribs. "Yes. Who are you?" The woman stepped into the room. The door clicked shut behind her, sealing us inside. "My name is Victoria Croft," she said, her voice smooth and echoing with absolute authority. "I am the managing partner of Croft & Associates. I represent the private estate of your late grandfather, Thomas Miller, and I believe it is time we discuss the future your family tried to bury." The name hung in the sterile air of my hospital room. Thomas Miller. Hearing my grandfather mentioned in this cold, clinical space felt like a sudden shift in the weather. For the first time since waking up from the coma, the tight knot of panic in my chest began to loosen, replaced by a profound wave of grief. My grandfather had passed away just 3 months before my accident. Victoria Croft stepped further into the room. She moved with a quiet, deliberate grace. She did not look at the medical monitors or the bruised skin covering my arms. She pulled the plastic visitor chair closer to my bed, the same chair the social worker had just vacated, and sat down. She placed her leather briefcase flat across her knees. The silver clasps caught the harsh fluorescent light above us. To understand why this woman was sitting in my hospital room, you have to understand the man who sent her. Thomas Miller was a man carved directly from the Alaskan coastline. He did not care about stock portfolios, country club memberships, or the superficial networking events that consumed my parents. He was a commercial fisherman who spent 40 years pulling salmon and halibut from the freezing, unpredictable waters of Kachemak Bay. He lived on a sprawling 400-acre property at the edge of Homer. If you have never been to Homer, it is a place where the mountains drop straight into the ocean. My grandfather built his cabin there with his own calloused hands. The air around his property always smelled of salt spray, aged cedar wood, and wood smoke. It smelled like honesty. When I was a child, my parents would drag us down to Homer for obligatory holiday visits. My mother, Susan, would complain the entire 4-hour drive from Anchorage. She would step out of her pristine luxury SUV, wearing designer boots, visibly disgusted by the gravel driveway and the scent of the nearby fish processing plants. My father, David, would pace on the wooden deck holding his phone to the sky, endlessly irritated by the lack of cellular service. They looked at my grandfather and saw a stubborn old man living in the dirt. But Thomas saw right through them. He was a quiet man, but his silence was never empty. It was the silence of an apex predator observing its surroundings. He watched my parents funnel their resources into maintaining a hollow image. He watched my sister Jessica throw tantrums over designer handbags while he was patching holes in his fishing nets. He knew Brad, my brother-in-law, was nothing but a smooth-talking grifter, building a house of cards on leveraged debt. Thomas and I shared a different bond. I spent my teenage summers on his boat. He taught me how to read the tides, how to gut a silver salmon, and how to sit entirely still while bald eagles circled the spruce trees above us. He was the one who encouraged me to pursue wildlife rehabilitation. While my parents called my sanctuary job a waste of potential, Thomas told me that a person who only chases price tags will eventually sell their own soul. He valued hard work, respect for the land, and loyalty. My family possessed none of those traits. 3 months ago, Thomas died of a sudden stroke. The funeral was held in a small wooden church near the Homer Spit. My parents treated the entire service like an inconvenient chore. My father did not even wear a proper suit, opting for a casual golf jacket because, as he told my mother, there was nobody important to impress in a fishing town. The very next afternoon, while we were packing up my grandfather's belongings, I walked onto the back deck of the cabin. My father was pacing near the tree line, speaking loudly on his cell phone. He was talking to Brad. I stood in the shadow of the doorway and listened to him map out the future of the place I loved most in the world. "We are liquidating the old man, useless coastal dirt," my father had said, his voice brimming with arrogant confidence. "The property alone will cover your startup margins by next quarter. We will sell the commercial fishing fleet by the end of the month. It is a gold mine just sitting here gathering dust." I turned around and walked away. I did not fight them. I did not care about the acreage, the boats, or the potential real estate value. I only cared that the man who taught me how to bandage a wounded gull was gone. I assumed the probate process was just a formality. My parents were his only immediate heirs. They had always boasted that they would inherit his estate and finally convert his rustic life into actual, usable capital. I accepted that the Homer cabin was gone forever. Now, staring at the immaculate attorney sitting at the foot of my hospital bed, that assumption began to crack. Victoria Croft rested her hands on top of her briefcase. Her gaze drifted to the rolling tray table where the hospital social worker had left the financial responsibility form. The document bearing my parents' declined signatures was sitting in plain sight. Victoria reached out and picked up the paper. Her eyes scanned the text. Her expression did not change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "They really left you with the bill," she stated. Her voice held no surprise, only a cold, clinical validation of a theory she had already proven. I swallowed the dry lump in my throat. "I am going to set up a payment plan," I told her, trying to maintain some shred of dignity. "The social worker said my insurance benefits are maxed out. My parents severed their financial ties 2 days after the crash." Victoria set the paper face down on the table. She looked at me with a gaze so sharp it felt like it could cut glass. "You will not be setting up a payment plan, Emily," she said evenly, "and you will not be dealing with hospital collection agencies." I gripped the edge of my blanket. "Who exactly are you?" I asked. "I am a private wealth executor," she replied. "Your grandfather retained my firm 5 years ago. He gave me very specific instructions on how to handle his affairs upon his passing. More importantly, he gave me instructions on how to handle your parents." She unclasped the leather briefcase. The metallic snap echoed loudly in the quiet room. "Since the day of the funeral," Victoria continued, "your father has been parading around Anchorage, telling his investors that he owns 400 acres of prime coastal real estate. He has been leveraging that assumption to keep Brad out of bankruptcy court. They have been acting like royalty, waiting for the probate courts to hand them the keys to a kingdom they did not build." Victoria pulled a thick stack of documents from the briefcase. The papers were bound in heavy blue covers, sealed with a gold foil stamp. She rested the stack on her lap and folded her hands over it. "But Thomas was a fisherman, Emily. He knew how to read the currents. He knew how to spot a shark circling in the water. And most importantly, he knew exactly how to set an inescapable trap." My breath caught in my chest. A spark of something electric and terrifying ignited in my mind. "Your grandfather did not leave his estate to your parents," Victoria said. Her voice lowered, carrying the weight of a judge delivering a final verdict. "And he did not leave it to a standard will that could be contested in a public courtroom." She slid the blue binder across the tray table until it rested right in front of me. "He left it to you." I stared at the heavy blue binder resting on my tray table. The gold foil seal caught the harsh overhead light. My mind struggled to process the words Victoria Croft had just spoken. "He left it to you." The sentence echoed in the small hospital room. I looked from the binder to Victoria. My grandfather was a traditional man who believed in family hierarchy. I always assumed my parents would inherit his estate by default, simply because they were the next of kin. "A standard will goes through probate," Victoria explained, her voice steady and instructional. "Probate is a public process. It requires filings in the Anchorage court system. Anyone can look up the records. Anyone can contest the document. Your grandfather knew your father would hire a team of litigators to tie up a standard will for years, draining the estate until you were forced to settle just to pay the legal fees. Thomas was many things, Emily, but he was not a fool. She reached forward and opened the binder to the first tab. The crisp white paper revealed columns of dense legal terminology. 5 years ago, Thomas established an irrevocable trust, Victoria continued. An irrevocable trust is exactly what it sounds like. Once the ink dries, the terms cannot be altered, amended, or dissolved by anyone, not even the person who created it. He transferred every significant asset he owned out of his personal name and into this legal entity. When he passed away 3 months ago, he technically owned nothing on paper. There is no estate for your parents to inherit. There is no probate case to file. Victoria turned to the second tab, titled Asset Schedule. She placed her manicured finger at the top of the page. The trust holds the deed to the 400 acres of coastal property in Homer. It holds the titles to all 4 commercial fishing vessels in the fleet. She moved her finger down to a section labeled Liquid Accounts. It also holds the cash reserves from 40 years of commercial fishing. The current liquid balance is $3.5 million. You are the sole named beneficiary. I am the acting trustee. From this moment forward, every decision regarding these assets runs exclusively through us. My lungs forgot how to pull in air. $3.5 million. I worked for an environmental nonprofit. I bought my winter boots at secondhand sporting goods stores. I tracked my grocery budget down to the final dollar every Sunday evening. The sheer scale of that number felt like a foreign language, but more staggering than the money was the realization of what it meant. Less than an hour ago, I was drowning. My parents had abandoned me in a hospital bed because my survival threatened their financial comfort. They signed a piece of paper declaring me a liability and walked away. Now, looking at the crisp pages inside the blue binder, the entire power dynamic of my family shattered. I was no longer a burden. I was untouchable. Victoria seemed to read the shift in my posture. She turned to a third tab. Thomas did not just protect the land, she said softly. He protected you. He knew your career choice did not offer premium health coverage. He included a comprehensive medical directive within the trust charter. The trust is legally mandated to cover any and all healthcare expenses for the beneficiary utilizing the highest tier of private medical care available. Victoria reached into her briefcase and pulled out a sleek silver mobile phone. She placed it on the table. I already spoke with the hospital billing department on my way up to this floor, she said. I provided the trust routing numbers, your entire balance, the helicopter transport, the emergency trauma surgery, the 12 days in the intensive care unit has been paid in full. You owe this hospital nothing. You owe your parents nothing. I looked at the financial responsibility form still sitting on the edge of the table, the one my parents had signed to abandon me. A profound, hollow laugh escaped my chest. It hurt my bruised ribs, but I could not stop it. My father was currently downtown buying expensive cocktails for luxury real estate developers, leveraging a plot of land he did not own to save a son-in-law who was drowning in debt. They thought they held all the cards. They did not even know what game they were playing. We need to discuss our immediate next steps, Victoria said, bringing my focus back to the present. Your family is currently operating under the delusion that they are wealthy heirs. When the developers and the creditors demand actual proof of ownership, your father will panic. He will go to the county recorder office. He will discover the existence of the trust. And then what I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Then they will realize you hold the keys to their survival, Victoria replied. They will pivot. They will rush back to this hospital playing the role of terrified, loving relatives. They will use every emotional manipulation tactic in their arsenal to convince you to sign over the liquid cash to save Jessica and Brad from bankruptcy. We cannot allow them to corner you while you are physically vulnerable. Victoria stood up and smoothed the front of her jacket. You are not staying in this hospital, she announced. The environment here is too exposed. I have initiated the trust emergency protocol. I hired a private medical transport company. They specialize in secure long-distance patient transfers. In 2 hours, a specialized ambulance will arrive at the private loading dock downstairs. Where are you taking me? I asked. Home. Victoria said, a rare, genuine smile touching the corners of her mouth. "We are taking you to Homer." I blinked in surprise. "I cannot navigate that cabin," I told her. "The stairs, the wood stove, my leg is in a heavy brace. I cannot even stand unassisted." "You underestimate your grandfather," Victoria said. Thomas foresaw this possibility. "Over the last 3 months, I have used trust funds to retrofit the ground floor of the Homer property. It now functions as a private recovery suite. We installed an accessible ramp, a medical bed, and premium therapeutic equipment. I also hired a private nursing team. They will provide round-the-clock care until you can walk without that brace." I stared at her, overwhelmed by the meticulous, layered protection my grandfather had built for me from beyond the grave. He knew my parents would fail me. He planned for the exact moment they would walk away. He built a fortress, furnished it, and handed the keys to a woman who possessed the legal firepower to keep the predators outside the gates. Victoria picked up the silver phone. She dialed a brief extension and spoke in crisp, measured tones, confirming the transport arrival time. The efficiency of true wealth was something I had never experienced. My parents possessed the loud, desperate illusion of money. Victoria wielded actual capital, silent, precise, and devastatingly effective. An hour later, the room transformed into a flurry of organized activity. 2 private EMTs, wearing unmarked Navy uniforms, arrived with a specialized transport gurney. They bypassed the standard hospital protocols with a stack of release forms Victoria had already authorized. Helen, the social worker, stood in the hallway holding her manila folder, her eyes wide as she watched the private medical team carefully transition me from the hospital bed. Victoria handed Helen a final piece of paperwork, officially closing my file at the Anchorage Medical Center. As they wheeled me down the quiet private corridors toward the secure loading dock, I watched the fluorescent lights pass overhead. The sterile, unforgiving hospital was fading behind me. I was leaving the city where my parents built their kingdom of lies. The EMTs loaded me into the spacious, climate-controlled back of the transport vehicle. Victoria sat in the leather jump seat across from me, her briefcase resting securely on her lap. The heavy rear doors closed, shutting out the freezing Alaskan wind. The engine purred to life, smooth and powerful. As the vehicle pulled onto the highway heading south toward the Kenai Peninsula, I looked at my phone one last time. Still no messages from my mother. Still no calls from my father. They believed I was trapped in a hospital bed, buried under a mountain of debt they had engineered. They thought they had all the time in the world to ignore me. They were about to discover just how wrong they were. I spent my first few days in Homer breathing in the cold, salt air from the window of my grandfather's private recovery suite. Victoria had thought of everything. The room was equipped with a state-of-the-art medical bed, large windows overlooking the bay, and a private nurse named Sarah, who checked my vitals every 4 hours. For the first time since the accident, I felt safe. While I was drinking hot tea and watching the tide roll in a storm of a very different kind was making landfall back in Anchorage. I learned the exact details of this storm, later pieced together from hospital staff and the sheer panic of the voicemails that eventually flooded my phone. The 17th day after my accident started like any other morning for my parents. David sat at the Marble Island in his pristine kitchen, drinking premium coffee and reviewing his business emails. He was in an excellent mood. He had just secured a verbal agreement with a group of luxury resort developers to sell the 400 acres in Homer. He had even accepted a substantial cash advance from them, funneling the money directly to Brad to cover a series of defaulted loans. David believed the probate courts would rubber stamp his inheritance by the end of the month. Then, the morning mail arrived. Susan brought a stack of envelopes into the kitchen and tossed them onto the counter. Near the bottom of the pile was a thick certified letter bearing the heavy, embossed seal of Croft & Associates. David opened it expecting a standard timeline for the liquidation of the Thomas Miller estate. Instead, he pulled out a formal declaration of trust execution. The legal phrasing was dense, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The letter stated that the firm was denying his claim to the estate. It detailed that Thomas owned 0 personal assets at the time of his death. Every piece of property, every commercial fishing vessel, and all liquid capital had been transferred into an irrevocable trust 5 years prior. The final paragraph contained the lethal blow. The sole legal beneficiary of the entire estate was Emily Garcia. David dropped his coffee mug. It shattered against the hardwood floor, sending dark liquid splashing across the imported rug. Susan rushed over, demanding to know what was wrong. David handed her the letter, his hands shaking. The color drained from Susan's face as she read the words. Jessica, who had stopped by to complain about Brad mounting business debts, snatched the paper from her mother. The illusion of their wealth evaporated in an instant. They realized they did not own the coastal land. They did not have access to the fishing fleet. They did not have a single dollar of the $3.5 million in liquid cash. More terrifying than the loss of the inheritance was the legal peril David had just stepped into. He had taken a cash advance from ruthless developers for a piece of real estate he had zero legal right to sell. If he could not produce the deed, he would be liable for fraud. Panic set in, but my family rarely let panic turn into self-reflection. Instead, they quickly rationalized the situation. They remembered where they had left me. In their minds, I was still the naive, soft-hearted daughter lying helpless in a sterile hospital bed. They assumed I was drowning in medical debt, terrified and alone. They figured I had no idea how to manage a multi-million-dollar trust. David formulated a plan right there in the kitchen. They would drive straight to the Anchorage Medical Center. They would play the role of the devoted, worried parents. They would tell me the trust was a complicated legal burden that I was too sick to handle. They would offer to pay my hospital parking fees as a gesture of goodwill, and then they would slide a transfer document in front of me to sign the assets over to their management. They viewed my physical trauma not as a tragedy, but as a convenient leverage point. The three of them piled into Susan's immaculate SUV. During the drive, they rehearsed their lines. Jessica practiced her fake tears. David practiced his firm, reassuring, fatherly tone. They walked through the sliding glass doors of the hospital with the unearned confidence of people who believe wealth and status make them immune to consequence. They bypassed the visitor registration desk, ignoring the protocol rules, and marched directly to the step-down unit on the 4th floor. They reached the large circular nursing station where they had abandoned me weeks prior. Standing behind the high counter was Claire. She was the same charge nurse who had held my hand while I read their cruel text messages. She recognized them the moment they stepped off the elevator. She remembered their names, and she remembered the financial decline form they had signed before vanishing to attend a charity gala. David stepped up to the counter. He checked his expensive watch, projecting an air of extreme impatience, acting as though his time was far more valuable than hers. "We are here to see Emily Garcia," David said, his voice loud enough to turn the heads of the other nurses. "Room 412. Claire did not pull up my chart. She did not reach for a visitor badge. She simply stood there and looked at the three of them. She looked at Susan's designer coat and Jessica's expensive handbag. David sighed, clearly annoyed by the slight delay. "Has our daughter still not been discharged yet? We need to get her paperwork sorted out immediately." Claire did not blink. She did not smile. She looked at my father with a cold, piercing disdain that stripped away every ounce of his country club prestige. "Your daughter was discharged 3 days ago by the private medical transport her trust arranged. Did her attorney not tell you?" The words hung in the quiet air of the hospital corridor. David's jaw went slack. Susan clutched her purse so tightly her knuckles turned white. Jessica stared blankly at the nurse, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The sentence Claire delivered dismantled their entire reality in less than 10 seconds. Private medical transport, her trust, her attorney. These were words associated with immense power, capital, and autonomy. The realization hit them with the force of a physical blow. Emily was not a helpless victim crying in a cheap hospital bed. Emily was a multi-millionaire shielded by ironclad legal armor, and most importantly, Emily was gone. The humiliation settled over them like a heavy blanket. Other families in the waiting area were watching. The nursing staff behind the counter exchanged knowing glances. The Garcia family, who prided themselves on projecting absolute control and social dominance, were standing in a public lobby looking like fools who had just lost a fortune. "Where did she go?" David demanded, his voice cracking, the polished veneer finally shattering. "You have to give me her forwarding address. I am her father." Claire crossed her arms over her blue scrubs. "Under federal privacy laws, I cannot provide you with any medical or locational information regarding a discharged patient," she said evenly. Furthermore, her legal counsel placed a strict block on her file. "Now please step away from the desk before I call hospital security to escort you out." They had no choice but to retreat. They turned and walked back toward the elevator in total silence. The arrogant swagger was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered terror. As the elevator doors closed, shielding them from the judging eyes of the hospital staff, the reality of their situation locked them in. The luxury resort developers were going to call David's cell phone by the end of the week. Brad creditors were going to file default notices against Jessica Boutique. The walls were closing in fast. The only person on earth who could save them from total financial and social ruin was the daughter they had treated like garbage. They needed to find me, and they needed to do it before the developers realized the land deal was a lie. The drive from the Anchorage Medical Center back to my parents' house took 20 minutes. Nobody spoke a single word. The silence inside my mother's pristine luxury vehicle was thick and suffocating. My father gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles turned white. My sister Jessica stared blankly out the passenger window. The arrogant swagger they had carried into the hospital was gone. They had walked in expecting to bully a sick girl. They walked out realizing they had just picked a fight with a multi-million-dollar legal fortress. When they arrived at the house, the front door was already unlocked. Jessica's husband Brad was pacing in the foyer. Brad was wearing a tailored suit, but his tie was pulled loose and his face was pale. He had spent the entire morning dodging phone calls from his private equity investors. He looked up when the three of them walked inside, expecting to see a signed asset transfer document. "Did you get her to sign it?" Brad asked, his voice tight with anxiety. "Did you get the transfer for the coastal land?" My father walked past him without making eye contact. He went straight to the living room, opened a crystal decanter, and poured himself a glass of bourbon. "David," Brad said, following him into the room, "I am not asking for an update. I am demanding one. The grace period on my commercial loan expired at midnight. The private equity firm is sending auditors to my office on Monday morning. If I cannot show them proof of collateral, they are going to file a default notice. They will seize the boutique. They will seize the house." My father drank the bourbon in one swallow. He set the glass down on the mahogany table with a heavy thud. "She is gone," my father said. Brad froze. "What do you mean she is gone?" "She is in a coma. She woke up," Jessica said, her voice trembling, as she dropped her designer handbag onto the sofa. "She woke up and her attorney arranged a private medical transport. The nurses refused to tell us where they took her. She has the trust, Brad. She has all of it." Brad staggered backward, leaning against the doorframe for support. His perfectly curated life of leased luxury cars and expensive dinners was built entirely on the assumption that my grandfather's wealth would bail him out. Now that safety net had vanished. "It gets worse," my father said quietly. He stared at the empty crystal glass. Susan turned to look at her husband. "How could this possibly get worse, David?" My father rubbed his temples. "The resort developers from Seattle, the ones who wanted the 400 acres of coastal property. They required a showing of good faith before they finalized the acquisition paperwork. I signed a preliminary letter of intent last week. I represented myself as the sole legal owner of the land." Brad's eyes widened in horror. "You signed a legal document claiming ownership of property that belongs to an irrevocable trust." "Yes," my father said. "And based on that signature, they wired a $100,000 advance into our joint business account. I used that money to cover your margin calls 2 days ago, Brad. The money is spent." The room fell into a dead, terrified silence. The stakes had just shifted from simple greed to severe criminal liability. If the Seattle developers discovered my father did not own the land, They would not just walk away. They would demand their money back immediately. When my father failed to produce the cash, they would hand the forged letter of intent over to the district attorney. My father had committed wire fraud and real estate fraud in a single stroke. Have you ever watched someone panic when they realize the person they discarded is suddenly the only person who can save them? Tell me in the comments. While my family stood in that Anchorage living room facing the destruction of their false empire, I was sitting in a recliner 300 miles away. The coastal sanctuary my grandfather built in Homer was a haven of healing. The private recovery suite smelled of aged cedar and the salty breeze blowing off Kachemak Bay. My physical therapy was grueling, but it was working. The private nurse Victoria hired was strict but incredibly kind. She guided me through my daily exercises, helping me put weight on my injured leg. For the first time in my life, I was not worried about managing my family expectations. I was not worried about paying my rent. I sat by the window watching bald eagles circle the spruce trees along the water edge, feeling a profound sense of peace. The storm of my old life felt very far away. But a storm does not just dissipate because you stop looking at the clouds. Back in Anchorage, the panic had morphed into a desperate, frantic hunt. My family needed me to sign a document authorizing a cash disbursement from the trust. They needed it before Monday morning. Susan pulled out her phone and called my number. It went straight to a generic voicemail. I had instructed Victoria to block their numbers the moment I left the hospital. David tried calling Victoria Croft Law Firm. The receptionist politely informed him that Ms. Croft did not accept unscheduled calls and immediately disconnected the line. "They cannot hide her forever," Brad said, pacing the length of the living room. "She is injured. She requires medical equipment. She has to be somewhere accessible." "She does not have any friends with money," Jessica said dismissively. "She works at that pathetic wildlife charity. None of those people can afford to hide a trauma patient." My father's head snapped up. The wildlife charity. He grabbed his car keys off the kitchen counter. "Emily is too soft-hearted," he said, a cold, calculating light returning to his eyes. "She would not just disappear without telling her coworkers. She thinks those people are her real family. I guarantee someone at that sanctuary knows where the transport took her." David drove straight to the non-profit Wildlife Rehabilitation Center on the edge of the city. He parked his expensive vehicle in the muddy gravel lot, standing out like a sore thumb among the rusted pickup trucks and volunteer vehicles. He walked into the main office, adjusting his posture to project the image of a grieving, terrified parent. A young woman named Kelly was working the front desk. She was a junior volunteer, underpaid and easily intimidated by authority. She looked up from her clipboard as my father approached the counter. "Can I help you?" Sir Kelly asked. My father put both hands on the counter, letting his shoulders slump. He manufactured a look of deep, profound exhaustion. "My name is David Garcia," he said, his voice thick with fake emotion. "I am Emily's father." Kelly's eyes softened immediately. "Oh my goodness. We have been so worried about her. We sent a card to the hospital, but they told us she was transferred. Is she doing okay?" My father let out a shaky sigh. "That is why I'm here, Kelly. Emily suffered a severe head injury in the crash. She is confused. She checked herself out of the hospital against medical advice. We are terrified she is going to hurt herself. She is not answering her phone, and the police said they cannot file a missing persons report for another 24 hours. Kelly gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. "I know she cares about this place." My father continued, leaning closer, utilizing every ounce of his country club charm to manipulate her. "I was hoping she might have reached out to someone here. Did she mention a safe place she might go? We just want to bring her home and get her the medical care she needs." Kelly hesitated. She was a good person, and good people naturally want to help a desperate father. She furrowed her brow, thinking back over recent conversations. "She did not call the office," Kelly said slowly, "but right before the accident, she was talking a lot about her grandfather. She said he passed away recently. She told me he had a cabin down in Homer right on the water. She said it was the only place in the world where she felt truly safe." My father's heart leaped against his ribs, but he kept his expression perfectly troubled. Homer, you think she might have tried to go down there? It makes sense, Kelly said, nodding. It is a 400-acre property near the bay. She talked about it all the time. My father closed his eyes, pretending to be overwhelmed with relief. Thank you, Kelly. You have no idea what this means to our family. We are going to go get her right now. He turned and walked out of the office. The moment the wooden door swung shut behind him, the fake grief vanished from his face. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and dialed Susan's number. Pack a bag, my father said as he walked across the muddy gravel lot toward his car. Tell Brad and Jessica to get their coats. We are driving south. My family believed they had just solved their problem. They thought they had outsmarted the system. They assumed that because they knew my physical location, they still retained power over me. They packed their vehicle, fueled by desperation and a false sense of authority, preparing to drive down the Kenai Peninsula to force my hand. They were so focused on securing their own survival, they failed to realize one crucial detail. They were not driving toward a rescue mission. They were driving straight into the jaws of the trap my grandfather built. The afternoon sky over Homer was a pale, icy blue. I sat in a heavy wooden chair near the large picture window of my grandfather's recovery suite, resting my braced leg on a padded stool. Sarah, the private nurse Victoria had hired, was standing nearby recording my vital signs on a digital tablet. The only sounds in the room were the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hallway and the low, steady rush of the tide pushing against the pebble beach outside. Then came a sound that did not belong. It was the heavy, crunching grind of premium tires rolling over the long gravel driveway. I looked through the glass and saw my mother's pristine luxury SUV pull up near the timber porch. The vehicle looked entirely out of place against the backdrop of the rugged Alaskan wilderness. It was a machine built for city pavement and valet parking, now sitting idle in the mud of a commercial fisherman estate. Sarah looked up from her tablet. "Are you expecting visitors?" she asked, her voice calm but professional. "Mrs. Croft instructed me to restrict access to this property." I watched the 4 doors of the SUV swing open. My father, my mother, my sister Jessica, and her husband Brad stepped out into the biting coastal wind. They were dressed for a winter catalog photo shoot, draped in expensive wool and pristine leather. They looked up at the cabin, their eyes scanning the timber frame and the sprawling acreage. Even from behind the glass, I could see the desperate calculation on their faces. "No," I told Sarah quietly. "I was not expecting them, but let them inside." Sarah hesitated, her protective instincts kicking in. "Are you sure, Emily?" "I am sure," I replied. "You can step into the kitchen, Sarah. I will handle this." The heavy wooden front door swung open a moment later. The cold wind rushed into the foyer, followed immediately by a performance worthy of a theater stage. My mother entered first. She rushed across the room, her face contorted in an exaggerated mask of maternal panic. She stopped just short of embracing me, hovering her hands over my shoulders as if she were terrified of breaking my bruised ribs. "Emily, thank God," Susan gasped. Her voice was breathy and thick with manufactured emotion. "We have been out of our minds with worry." My father walked in right behind her. He was carrying 2 large brown paper bags from an upscale organic grocery store in Anchorage. A stalk of artisanal celery poked out from the top. It was a brilliant, highly calculated prop. He wanted to look like the providing patriarch bringing sustenance to his injured child. "We brought you some real food," David said, setting the bags on the rustic wooden dining table. He let out a long, heavy sigh, wiping his forehead, as if he had just completed a grueling rescue mission. Jessica and Brad lingered near the entryway. Jessica looked around the cedar-walled room with quiet distaste, her eyes snagging on the worn leather furniture and the wood-burning stove. Brad kept checking his phone, tapping his foot against the floorboards, radiating a nervous energy he could not hide. I sat still in my chair and looked at my parents. I did not scream. I did not ask them why they abandoned me 12 days into a coma. I simply watched them execute the exact playbook Victoria Croft had warned me about. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and deliberately fragile. "The hospital said you stopped answering their calls." My father's face hardened in mock indignation. He stepped closer, shaking his head. The hospital administration was entirely incompetent, Emily. The billing department gave us the runaround for a week. They lost your primary paperwork and claimed you were transferred to a public ward. We have been calling every single day trying to track you down. Susan nodded, vigorously pulling a tissue from her designer purse and dabbing at the dry corners of her eyes. It was a nightmare, sweetheart. We were terrified. When we went back to the unit this morning, some rude nurse finally admitted you had been moved. We drove straight here the moment we found out. I listened to the seamless delivery of their lies. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. If I had not read the 72 text messages complaining about parking fees, I might have believed them. If I had not seen the financial refusal form bearing their signatures, I might have leaned into my mother, hovering hands, and cried. If I had not spoken to Victoria, I might have felt guilty for making them drive 300 miles in the cold. But I had read the texts. I had seen the signatures. I knew about the fraudulent land deal with the Seattle developers. I knew Brad was drowning in private equity debt. They were not standing in this cabin because they loved me. They were standing here because they needed my signature to save themselves from financial ruin and a criminal indictment. The anger flared in my chest, hot and bright. A younger version of me would have unleashed it. The old Emily would have confronted them, yelled until her throat burned, and demanded an apology she would never receive. But the old Emily died in that hospital bed. I remembered what it felt like to be powerless. Now, sitting in the sanctuary my grandfather built, I realized I held every single ounce of power in the room. Confronting them would only put them on the defensive. It would make them cautious. If you want to catch a predator, you do not build a wall. You open a door. I took a slow, shallow breath, ensuring my expression remained perfectly open and vulnerable. I let my shoulders slump. I looked up at my father with wide, trusting eyes. "I am so glad you are here," I said. My voice was a whisper. It has been so scary doing this alone. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The collective exhale from my family was palpable. The tension drained from my father's shoulders. Susan dropped her tissue back into her purse. Brad finally stopped tapping his foot. Jessica walked further into the room, taking off her expensive leather gloves. They had tested the waters, and they believed they had won. They thought I swallowed their lies whole. In their minds, I was still the soft-hearted, easily manipulated wildlife girl who just wanted her family to stay together. David smiled. It was the smooth, polished smile he used to close business deals. "We are here now, Emily. That is all that matters. You do not have to worry about a thing. We are going to take care of everything for you." Susan walked over to the dining table and began unpacking the groceries. She pulled out imported cheeses, expensive bottled water, and organic fruits, stacking them onto the rustic countertops. She was treating the cabin like an Airbnb she had just rented, taking ownership of the space. "I just could not believe Thomas left this place looking so dated," Susan remarked, wrinkling her nose at the vintage cast-iron stove. "We are going to need to hire a cleaning crew to come down from Anchorage and properly sanitize this kitchen." David walked toward the large picture window, gazing out at the 400 acres of coastal land stretching toward the bay. His eyes were wide with calculation. He was not looking at trees and water. He was looking at the luxury resort he promised the Seattle developers. He was looking at his ticket out of prison. "It is a massive property," David muttered almost to himself. "The grading alone is perfect for commercial development." Jessica sat down on the leather sofa, crossing her legs. "How long do you have to wear that hideous brace, Emily?" she asked, sounding bored. "You know Brad has a huge charity dinner next month. We were hoping you could babysit the dogs, but you cannot even walk." "I will be out of the brace in a few weeks," I replied evenly. "The physical therapy is helping." My family settled into the cabin like a conquering army. They assumed control of the environment because I permitted it. They drank coffee from my grandfather mugs. They adjusted the thermostat to their liking. They complained about the lack of premium cellular service on the peninsula. I sat quietly in my chair and watched them. I employed the illusion of compliance flawlessly. I thanked Susan for the groceries. I nodded when David gave me unsolicited advice about my recovery timeline. I smiled when Jessica complained about her boutique staff. They felt completely secure. They felt superior. And because they felt secure, they were about to become incredibly careless. They believed they had successfully navigated the crisis of my disappearance. They assumed the trust Victoria mentioned was just a minor legal hurdle they could easily persuade me to dismantle. They did not know that Victoria had already instructed the trust accounting firm to flag any external attempts to access the capital. They did not know that the local county clerk had already formally recorded the irrevocable deed. Brad checked his phone again. The screen illuminated his face. He typed a rapid response, his jaw clenched tight. I knew the grace period on his commercial loan was evaporating by the hour. The pleasantries and the fake concern were a necessary prologue, but they did not have the luxury of time. My father turned away from the window and looked at Brad. A silent, urgent communication passed between them. The initial performance was over. The groundwork was laid. Now they needed to execute the extraction. David walked over and stood beside my chair. He looked down at me with an expression of deep manufactured empathy. Emily. He started, his tone shifting into the smooth cadence of a negotiator. We need to talk about the future. We need to talk about what Thomas left behind. The first 48 hours with my family inside the Homer timber home felt like watching a poorly rehearsed stage play slowly fall apart. The illusion of deep maternal concern and fatherly duty could only stretch so far under the weight of reality. They were creatures of city pavement and country club lounges. The rugged coastal environment grated on their nerves. The cabin possessed no high-speed internet connection. The primary heat source was a large cast-iron wood stove that required physical labor to maintain. My father paced the hardwood floorboards for hours, holding his expensive cell phone to the window, grumbling about the poor cellular reception. My mother spent her time wiping down pristine cedar countertops with imported antibacterial wipes, acting as if the natural wood grain was a hazard to her health. But the most rapid unraveling belonged to Jessica and her husband. Jessica had always operated under the firm belief that the universe owed her a comfortable seat. Growing up, our family dynamic was rigidly defined. If Jessica wanted a custom designer dress for a high school formal, my parents simply canceled my summer camp registration to fund her wardrobe. She never learned the difference between earning a living and demanding a lifestyle. Brad was cut from the exact same cloth. He chased the aesthetic of wealth without ever understanding the mechanics of generating it. By the third morning, the cramped proximity was driving them toward desperation. My parents decided to drive into the small town of Homer to locate a coffee shop that served proper espresso. Sarah, my private nurse, had stepped out to the separate annex building to log her daily shift reports and organize my upcoming medication schedule. I was left alone in the main living area with my older sister and my brother-in-law. Jessica walked out of the guest bedroom wearing a floor-length silk robe that snagged on the rustic floorboards. She poured herself a glass of filtered water, walked over to my medical recovery chair, and perched herself on the edge of the heavy oak coffee table. Brad remained in the adjacent kitchen area. He pretended to read a local newspaper, but his posture was rigid and alert. He was listening to every single breath in the room. Jessica started her pitch with a heavy sigh. She smoothed the expensive silk fabric over her knees and adopted a facial expression of profound, weary sadness. Emily, we need to have a serious talk about reality, Jessica said. Her tone dripped with a manufactured, cloying sympathy. You know, Brad and I have always supported your choices. We always wanted the best for your little animal charity. But things are getting precarious for us in Anchorage. She leaned forward, lowering her voice, as if she were sharing a painful, intimate secret. The economy is brutal right now. Brad has investors who are being incredibly unreasonable regarding some commercial loan timelines. They are threatening to seize my boutique. They are threatening to foreclose on our home. Mom and Dad are tapped out trying to keep us afloat. Jessica reached out and rested her perfectly manicured hand over my heavy knee brace. You never cared about status, Emily. You always said you just wanted a simple, quiet life. Thomas, leaving you all this capital, it does not even make sense for your lifestyle. Wealth like this is a burden. It changes people. It ruins the simple life you love so much. You do not need millions of dollars to feed injured birds. We need it to survive." She offered a tight, desperate smile. "If you could just authorize a transfer from the liquid accounts just enough to cover the margins and get the investors off our backs, it would save the family. You would be a hero, Emily. You could stay down here with your birds and we could go back to our lives." I looked down at her hand resting on my injured leg. She was not asking for a temporary loan. She was demanding her inheritance early. She was utilizing my physical trauma as a lever to secure funding for her vanity project. She truly believed I was ignorant enough to hand over my grandfather's life savings to a man who leased luxury sports cars to impress strangers. My parents had trained her to view me as a resource rather than a sister, and she was playing her assigned role flawlessly. I kept my face perfectly neutral. I did not pull my leg away. I placed my hand over hers and offered a slow, gentle nod. "I know things are very stressful right now," I told her quietly. "You do not have to worry, Jessica. I am going to make sure the family gets exactly what they deserve. I will make sure everyone is taken care of." Jessica exhaled a sharp breath of profound relief. She squeezed my knee, stood up, and looked back at the kitchen. Brad dropped the newspaper onto the counter. A smug, victorious smile spread across his face. They heard exactly what they wanted to hear. They mistook my vague reassurance for a binding promise. They assumed my empathy was a blank check. Because they felt secure in their manipulation, their behavior shifted from cautious to brazen. That same afternoon, the illusion of their loving concern vanished entirely. I watched from my large picture window as Brad walked the perimeter of the coastal property. He was not admiring the ancient spruce trees or the sweeping view of Ketchimek Bay. He was holding a digital surveying tool he had retrieved from the trunk of his vehicle. He paced the frozen ground, measuring the exact distance from the timberline to the water edge. He was acting like a developer, evaluating his newly acquired real estate. An hour later, my father returned from town with an arrogant spring in his step. He sat down at the dining table, flipped open his laptop, and pulled up public zoning maps for the Kenai Peninsula. He started talking loudly to Brad across the room, discussing commercial grading access roads and soil stability. My father pointed out the window, casually mentioning how much it would cost to clear out the old timber to make room for a paved grand entrance. They were openly planning the destruction of my grandfather's pristine sanctuary right in front of me. They believed my earlier conversation with Jessica gave them the ultimate green light to proceed with the resort development. My father even drafted an email to the Seattle developers, assuring them that the minor legal hurdles regarding the title transfer were resolved and the deed would be in their hands shortly. They thought my quiet compliance was a symptom of my inherent weakness. They did not realize it was a calculated tactic. Victoria had taught me that true predators only expose their throats when they think their prey is dead. By offering my sister a vague, empty promise, I handed my family enough rope to hang their entire financial empire. They were rapidly accelerating their timeline, taking disastrous legal liberties behind my back, assuming I was too medicated and too soft to notice the trap closing tight around them. The Kenai Peninsula possesses a specific kind of silence in the late afternoon. It is not empty, but heavy with the sound of the ocean and the wind moving through the ancient spruce trees. Inside the cabin, however, the silence felt increasingly synthetic. The performance my family was maintaining required constant effort, and the cracks were beginning to show in ways they did not even realize. I spent most of the fourth day resting in my recovery chair, working through the painful physical therapy exercises Sarah had assigned. From my vantage point near the large front window, I had a clear view of the driveway and the timberline. My father had spent the entire morning glued to his cell phone. He paced the wooden deck, speaking in hushed, urgent tones. He thought the thick glass of the window muffled his voice, but the wind carried fragments of his conversation back toward the house. I watched him wave his hands, emphatically pointing toward the water. He was speaking to the Seattle developers. I could hear him promising that the minor legal delays regarding the deed were resolved and that the title transfer was imminent. He was projecting the total authority of a patriarch who held absolute control over his family assets. But verbal promises do not satisfy corporate real estate developers. They require signatures. They require legally binding documentation. David knew he was walking on a razor-thin edge. The $100,000 advance he had already spent on Brad debts meant the developers owned him until he delivered the land. He needed a way to bypass the slow, methodical pace of standard probate, and he needed a way to bypass me. That afternoon, while my mother was complaining about the water pressure in the guest bathroom and Jessica was taking a nap, I heard the distinctive sound of rustling paper coming from the kitchen. I shifted in my chair, adjusting the heavy brace on my leg. I looked past the stone fireplace. David was standing at the rustic island counter. He had a manila folder spread open in front of him. It was a folder I recognized immediately. It was my old financial file from when I lived in Anchorage, a file I had kept stored in a box at their house because I rarely had a permanent address during my fieldwork assignments. He pulled a single yellowed sheet of paper from the stack. He smoothed it flat against the granite and stared at it with a look of profound, desperate triumph. Years ago, when I was 21 and moving into my first apartment near the wildlife sanctuary, the property management company required a co-signer because my income was low. They also required a specific limited power of attorney document allowing my father to execute the lease agreement on my behalf while I was out of town on a remote bird tagging expedition. The document was intended solely for that single residential lease. It had expired years ago. It held no legal weight for broad financial decisions, and it certainly held no authority over a multi-million-dollar irrevocable trust. But David was not thinking like a rational business owner. He was thinking like a man trying to outrun a falling anvil. He pulled out a pen and began making notes in the margins. He was planning to present that outdated, legally defunct piece of paper to the county clerk. He believed he could use it to fast-track the deed transfer, assuming the local clerks in Homer would be intimidated by his expensive suit and aggressive demeanor. He intended to forge a modern date claim, full legal proxy over my affairs, and sell my grandfather land right out from under me before I ever stood up from my recovery chair. He did not know that utilizing a voided power of attorney to execute a real estate transaction is a felony. He did not know that Victoria Croft had already flagged the deed at the county office, meaning any document submitted with my name would trigger an immediate review by the local district attorney. He was digging his own grave with a stolen shovel. While David was plodding in the kitchen, Brad was growing increasingly reckless outside. The grace period on his commercial loan was now measured in hours, not days. He needed collateral to show his private equity investors by Monday morning, and he could not wait for my father's bureaucratic maneuvering. I looked out the window and saw Brad walking near the edge of the property where the tree line met the beach. He was no longer using a digital surveying tool. He was driving wooden stakes into the frozen ground, marking off designated acreage plots. He was holding a clipboard drafting a preliminary subdivision map. I watched him hammer a stake near the old wooden dock my grandfather built with his own hands. Thomas had spent decades maintaining that dock, weathering fierce Alaskan storms just to ensure his fishing vessels had a safe harbor. Brad was measuring it for demolition to make room for a luxury marina. The sheer arrogance of it was breathtaking. They were standing on land that did not belong to them, measuring it for destruction, assuming the woman sitting in the chair 50 yards away was too soft to stop them. They thought my silence was permission. They thought my trauma was their opportunity. I did not yell through the glass. I did not demand an explanation. I reached for the cell phone resting on the side table next to my chair. I opened a secure messaging application Victoria had installed before I left the hospital. I typed a single brief message, keeping my eyes fixed on Brad as he drove another wooden stake into the earth. "They are accelerating," I wrote. "He found the old residential power of attorney form. He is trying to use it." I hit send and waited. The response from Victoria came less than a minute later. "Let them. The trap is set. Do not interfere with his filing. The more paper he submits, the tighter the knot becomes. I locked my phone and set it down. A cold, hard satisfaction settled into my chest. The old Emily would have panicked. She would have confronted her father, begging him to stop giving him the chance to correct his mistake and hide his tracks. But I was no longer interested in protecting my family from their own nature. If David wanted to commit real estate fraud, I was going to let him. If Brad wanted to stake out a resort he would never build, I was going to let him. I was going to let them build their false empire as high as possible, knowing that Victoria held the sledgehammer that would shatter the foundation. My father folded the old document and slid it into his briefcase. He walked over to the window, completely unaware that I had been watching him the entire time. He looked out at Brad, offering a sharp, confident nod. "We are going to head back to Anchorage tomorrow morning," Emily David announced, turning to face me. He manufactured a warm, reassuring smile. "I have some business to handle in the city regarding the estate. Just boring paperwork." I offered him a soft, compliant smile in return. "Take your time, Dad," I said smoothly. "I know you are doing what is best for the family." His smile widened. He believed he had won. He believed the coastal land was his. He believed the millions in liquid capital were just waiting to be transferred. He packed his briefcase with the confidence of a king. But he was not a king. He was just a man walking blindfolded toward the edge of a cliff, completely unaware that the ground had already disappeared beneath his feet. The morning my family departed for Anchorage was a study in profound false confidence. They moved through the cabin with the crisp efficiency of people who believed their problems were entirely solved. My mother wiped down the kitchen counters one last time, complaining about the harsh minerals in the well water. Jessica packed her overnight bag loudly, discussing the interior design changes she planned to make once the resort construction began. Brad did not speak much, but the frantic, desperate energy that had consumed him for 3 days was gone. He looked like a man who had just won a high-stakes poker game. My father was the last to leave. He stood by the front door wearing a tailored wool coat, holding the briefcase that contained my forged signature. "We will see you this weekend," Emily David said. His voice was warm and resonant, projecting the image of a deeply caring patriarch. I sat in my recovery chair, adjusting the brace on my leg. "This weekend," I asked, keeping my tone perfectly mild. Susan walked over and placed a manicured hand on my shoulder. "We are hosting a dinner, sweetheart, at the Turnagain Country Club in Anchorage. We decided last night. It is a celebration of your recovery. You have been through such a terrible ordeal, and we want to officially welcome you back to the land of the living." She smiled down at me. The performance was flawless. A casual observer would see a loving mother organizing a joyous family reunion. I saw a predator setting out bait. David nodded in agreement. "We are sending a private luxury transport down to Homer on Saturday afternoon to pick you up. It is completely accessible for your leg brace. You do not have to lift a finger. Just focus on healing, and we will handle the rest." I looked at the two of them. They were not inviting me to a celebration. They were summoning me to a public staging ground. My father needed a high-profile venue to solidify his illusion of control. He needed an audience. The country club was his territory, filled with his peers, his business associates, and the people he desperately wanted to impress. I knew exactly what he was planning. He was going to stand up in front of the Anchorage elite, deliver a sentimental speech about my survival, and then publicly announce our new joint family venture. He intended to trap me in a social corner. He believed that if he made the announcement in front of 200 wealthy guests, I would be too embarrassed, too weak, and too compliant to contradict him. "That sounds wonderful," I told them, my voice smooth and agreeable. "Thank you. I would love to be there." They left the cabin 10 minutes later, their luxury SUV crunching down the long gravel driveway, carrying the fraudulent power of attorney document toward the city. The moment the vehicle disappeared past the tree line, Sarah walked out from the kitchen annex. She watched the dust settle on the road. "They seem very pleased with themselves," she remarked, her tone carefully neutral. "They are," I replied. I reached for my cell phone. But pride is usually the last thing a person feels before a massive fall. I called Victoria Croft. She answered on the first ring. They are gone, I said. David has the expired residential lease document. He is taking it to Anchorage. Excellent, Victoria said. Her voice was sharp and clear over the encrypted line. I will notify the county clerk office in Homer to flag the system. If he tries to file it locally, it will be automatically diverted to a fraud review protocol. What is his next move? He is hosting a dinner at the Turnagain Country Club this Saturday, I explained. He called it a recovery celebration. A recovery celebration, Victoria repeated. I could almost hear the cold smile in her voice. He is creating a theater. He invited the Seattle resort developers and Brad private equity investors, did he not? Yes, I said. He needs to show them that the family is united and the land deal is secure. He wants to corner me publicly. Victoria paused for a moment. Her legal mind was already analyzing the angles, calculating the precise amount of force required to shatter my father illusion. We are going to let him build his stage, Emily, Victoria said quietly. We are going to let him invite every single person he wants to impress. We are going to let him stand up and speak. And then we are going to burn the theater to the ground. I need something to wear, I told her. My mother threw out most of my practical clothes when she cleaned out my apartment, and I refused to wear anything they bought for me. Consider it handled, Victoria replied. The trust includes a discretionary fund for personal outfitting. I will have a selection of appropriate attire sent to the cabin by tomorrow morning. You are not going to a family dinner, Emily. You are attending a legal execution. Dress accordingly. The next 3 days moved with a terrifying electric speed. The physical therapy no longer felt like a chore. It felt like training. I pushed myself harder, forcing my injured leg to bear more weight. I needed to be able to stand on my own 2 feet when the moment arrived. On Friday morning, a courier arrived at the cabin, carrying 3 garment bags from a high-end boutique in Anchorage, a boutique that certainly was not owned by my sister. Victoria had selected the options herself. I chose a tailored emerald green sheath dress. It was elegant, sharp, and commanding. It was not the soft floral fabric my mother always pressured me to wear. It was armor. Saturday afternoon arrived with a cold, biting wind sweeping across the Kenai Peninsula. The luxury transport vehicle my father promised actually materialized. It was a massive black SUV with tinted windows and a professional driver. My father was using the last of his drained credit limits to fund this performance, desperate to maintain the facade of wealth until the Seattle developers handed over the final acquisition check. I sat in the back of the spacious vehicle as we drove the 3 hours north toward the city. The landscape shifted from the rugged, isolated beauty of the coastline to the sprawling paved infrastructure of Anchorage. The mountains loomed in the distance, sharp and unforgiving. When we pulled into the circular driveway of the Turnagain Country Club, the sun was already setting, casting long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns. The building was a testament to old money and exclusivity, with grand stone columns and massive glass windows glowing with warm, golden light. Valets in crisp uniforms hurried to open the doors of arriving luxury cars. My driver parked near the entrance and helped me navigate the heavy leg brace as I stepped out into the freezing air. I gripped my sleek carbon fiber walking cane, a recent upgrade provided by the Trust Medical Directive. I walked through the heavy oak double doors and into the grand foyer. The air smelled of expensive perfume, roasted meats, and blooming floral arrangements. A sweeping staircase led up to the main ballroom. I could hear the low, sophisticated hum of classical music and the clinking of crystal glasses. I paused at the bottom of the stairs, adjusting the emerald green fabric of my dress. My heart beat a steady, calm rhythm against my ribs. I was not the naive wildlife girl who woke up abandoned in a hospital bed. I was the sole beneficiary of the Thomas Miller estate. I began the slow climb up the stairs. When I reached the top, the double doors to the ballroom were wide open. The room was packed with at least 200 people. I recognized local politicians, wealthy business owners, and prominent socialites. My parents had pulled every string they had left to pack this room. I scanned the crowd. Near the center of the room, standing beneath a massive crystal chandelier, was my father. He was speaking to a group of men wearing sharp, dark suits. They did not look like local Alaskans. They carried the distinct, polished energy of corporate real estate, the Seattle developers. Brad was standing near the bar, looking incredibly tense, nursing a glass of scotch while a stern-looking man spoke quietly into his ear. The private equity investor. Susan and Jessica were floating through the crowd, laughing loudly, playing the roles of the gracious hostesses. My father spotted me first. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the emerald dress and the quiet, imposing confidence of my posture. He quickly masked his surprise with a broad, beaming smile. He raised his hand, gesturing for the room to quiet down. "Ladies and gentlemen," David called out, his voice echoing across the ballroom. "The guest of honor has arrived, my beautiful, resilient daughter, Emily." The entire room turned to look at me. 200 pairs of eyes assessing my value, judging my recovery, waiting to see how I fit into the narrative my father had carefully constructed. I offered a small, polite smile. I gripped the handle of my cane and walked directly into the center of the trap. I moved across the hardwood floor of the Turnagain Country Club. 200 people watched my slow progress. My carbon fiber cane tapped a rhythmic beat against the polished wood. Each step sent a dull ache radiating up my braced leg, but my mind was entirely clear. My father maintained his blinding smile. He stepped forward with his arms extended, playing the role of the relieved patriarch flawlessly. But as I closed the distance between us, my mind flashed back to the phone call I received 2 hours earlier. I was sitting in the back of the private transport vehicle. The tinted windows framed the snow-covered peaks of the Chugach Mountains passing in the fading twilight. The transition from the rugged coastal wilderness to the paved, sprawling infrastructure of the city mirrored the shift in my own life. The heater in the vehicle hummed a steady tune, but the facts Victoria Croft delivered over the phone were colder than the Alaskan wind outside. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She delivered a precise sequence of financial revelations. Her investigative team had uncovered the exact movements of my father over the last 72 hours. The ticking clock of his desperation was much louder than I ever imagined. Victoria explained the severe legal peril David carried in his leather briefcase. Alaska state law is incredibly strict regarding fiduciary duty, estate management, and property transfers. Submitting an expired residential lease proxy to bypass a registered irrevocable trust is not a minor administrative error. It is a Class B felony. It constitutes explicit, intentional fraud. The county clerk system in Homer had already been flagged by Victoria and her legal team. The moment my father attempted to file that forged paperwork, it would trigger an automatic mandatory review by the local district attorney. But the trap ran much deeper than a simple rejected filing. Victoria laid out the rest of the financial web my family had spun. The Seattle real estate firm did not just sign a preliminary letter of intent for the coastal acreage. Corporate acquisitions of that scale require a showing of tangible collateral. To secure the land rights, the developers wired a $100,000 good faith advance into my father's business account 3 days ago. David did not keep those funds in a secure escrow account. He did not hold the money pending the final title transfer. He transferred the money directly to Brad to satisfy the immediate margin calls from the private equity group. The cash was gone. It was spent on bad debts, luxury car leases, and keeping Jessica's failing boutique open for another month. If my father failed to produce the deed tonight, he could not simply refund the developers and apologize for the delay. He had spent corporate funds obtained under false pretenses that elevated his situation from a civil contract dispute to criminal theft by deception. Victoria made it clear that these developers were ruthless operators. They did not tolerate being played by local amateurs trying to punch above their weight class. If they realized the land was secured in a trust they could not touch, they would bypass civil litigation entirely. They would go straight to the authorities to make an example out of him. My father was hosting a lavish party to celebrate a deal that, if broken, would send him to a federal penitentiary. The air in the country club felt thick and suffocating. I looked at the Seattle developers standing near the grand stone fireplace. They wore expensive tailored suits and projected an aura of cold corporate efficiency. They were not here to celebrate my recovery from a 12-day coma. They were here to close a multi-million-dollar acquisition. They wanted to look the heir in the eye and watch her sign the final authorization. Beside them stood the private equity representative, a man with a rigid posture who held Brad's financial life in his hands. He was checking his expensive watch, clearly irritated by the theatrical delays. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and imported caviar. It was a lavish display of wealth that my father could no longer afford, funded entirely by the illusion of my grandfather's estate. Brad was sweating visibly near the bar, gripping his glass so tightly his knuckles were white. My father reached me. He placed his hands on my shoulders and leaned in for a theatrical embrace. He smelled of expensive cologne and cold sweat. He whispered in my ear, his voice tight and frantic beneath the polished surface. "Smile for the room, Emily," he muttered. "We are going to make this quick and seamless. Do not embarrass us in front of these people." He pulled back and turned to the crowd. He kept one heavy hand firmly pressed against the small of my back to guide me forward. He steered me toward the group of developers. My mother and sister trailed close behind, forming a physical barrier to prevent me from stepping away. Susan wore a frozen, terrifying grin. Jessica kept adjusting her diamond necklace, her eyes darting nervously around the room. They operated like a coordinated security detail, ensuring the prisoner reached the execution block. My father stopped in front of the lead developer, a tall man with silver hair and calculating flat eyes. David performed the introductions with a booming, jovial voice. He presented me as the brave, recovering daughter who recognized the immense burden of managing a sprawling coastal estate. "Emily has a deep connection to the wildlife," my father told the developer, offering a patronizing chuckle. "But she knows that turning that old dirt into a modern resort is the best path forward for the family legacy. We are all united in this venture." He painted a picture of a seamless transition of power. He assured the men from Seattle that I was eager to step aside and let the experienced businessmen handle the complex logistics of the resort development. Then David reached into the breast pocket of his tailored tuxedo. He pulled out a folded piece of heavy stock paper and a gold fountain pen. He handed them to me. It was not the expired power of attorney form. He was smarter than that. This was a newly drafted consent waiver. He wanted me to sign a document right there in front of the corporate developers and the entire Anchorage social elite. The waiver was designed to acknowledge that I surrendered my administrative rights to the trust legally authorizing him to act as the sole proxy for the land sale. He planned to take this newly signed waiver, staple it to his forged documents, and present a bulletproof package to the county clerk on Monday morning. He wanted to use the immense social pressure of the ballroom to force my hand. The room grew unnervingly quiet. The classical music seemed to fade into the background. The developers watched my hands. The private equity investor stepped closer, his gaze locked on the paper. My father pressed the cold gold pen against my palm. The expectation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. He believed I would never dare to cause a scene in front of his prestigious peers. He thought the weight of the audience would crush my resistance, leaving me with no choice but to sign away my future. I stood holding the gold fountain pen and the folded proxy waiver. My father looked at the small circle of corporate executives, then cast his gaze across the sprawling ballroom. A sudden shift occurred behind his eyes. He realized a quiet signature in the corner of the room would not provide the suffocating leverage he desired. He needed the weight of the entire Anchorage social registry pressing down on my shoulders. He reached out and gently took the document and the pen back from my hands, tucking them inside his tailored jacket. "We will save the formalities for dessert," he announced, his voice smooth and jovial. "Let us sit down and enjoy the evening. We have plenty to celebrate." He guided me toward the head table at the far end of the room. The dinner service began, initiating a slow, excruciating march toward his planned grand finale. The Turnagain Country Club represented the apex of social currency in our city. To host a private event in the main ballroom required steep upfront capital and deep connections. My father possessed neither. He had likely drained his final available credit lines just to rent the space and hire the catering staff. The tables were draped in heavy white linen. Crystal centerpieces caught the golden light of the chandeliers. A string quartet played softly near the grand windows overlooking the dark frozen golf course. I was seated at the center of the long head table. The lead developer from Seattle, a man introduced to me as Richard Vance, sat directly across from me. He did not engage in the superficial small talk that occupied the rest of the table. He ate his meal with an air of cold, calculated patience. He was not here to socialize. He was here to collect the deed his firm had already paid a $100,000 advance to secure. Brad sat to my immediate left. The bravado he displayed back at the coastal cabin was gone. He was sweating through the collar of his expensive dress shirt, ordering double pours of scotch from every waiter that passed our section. The private equity representative sat 2 chairs down, keeping his eyes locked on Brad with the unwavering focus of a collections officer. My mother sat on my right. She spent the meal leaning in to offer tight, whispered instructions under the guise of maternal affection. "Sit up straight," Emily Susan murmured, her voice barely audible over the clinking silverware. "You are slouching. Everyone is looking at you. Do not embarrass us tonight. Your father has worked too hard to put this deal together." I took a slow sip of my ice water. I looked at the hundreds of guests eating roasted prime rib and drinking imported wine. These were the people my parents had spent 2 decades trying to impress. Local politicians, affluent business owners, and prominent socialites filled the room. My father was treating this dinner as his official coronation into the Anchorage elite. He was riding a wave of unearned prestige funded entirely by the illusion of a commercial empire he did not own. As the waitstaff cleared the dinner plates and began pouring champagne for the final course, the string quartet ceased playing. My father stood up. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and tapped the side of it with a silver dessert spoon. The sharp, clear ringing cut through the low hum of conversation. The ballroom quieted, turning their collective attention toward the head table. David adjusted the cuffs of his tuxedo, soaking in the silence. He offered a warm, humble smile to the crowd. Friends, colleagues, and esteemed guests, my father began, his voice projecting effortlessly across the room. "I want to thank you all for gathering here tonight. We are here to celebrate something far more valuable than business. We are here to celebrate life." He gestured toward me. The spotlight of 200 gazes shifted to my face. "A few weeks ago, our family faced an unimaginable nightmare." He continued, lowering his voice to a somber emotional register. "My youngest daughter, Emily, was involved in a terrible accident on the icy roads of the Glen Highway. We sat by her hospital bed for 12 agonizing days, watching the monitors, holding our breath, and praying for a miracle." The hypocrisy of his words hit me with physical force. He stood there, bathed in the warm light of the chandeliers, weaving a fictional narrative of devotion. He spun a tale of holding bedside vigils, when in reality he was complaining about parking fees and signing a financial refusal form to abandon me to medical debt. He weaponized my trauma, using the coma he ignored to earn the sympathy of the wealthiest people in the city. "But family sticks together through tragedy," my father declared, his tone rising with triumphant pride. "We do not walk away when things get hard. We hold the line. And tonight, looking at Emily sitting here with us, I can confidently say that our family has never been stronger." A wave of polite, respectful applause rippled through the ballroom. Susan reached over and placed her hand over mine, smiling tearfully for the benefit of the onlookers. I kept my face perfectly neutral, letting the cold reality of the moment harden my resolve. David raised his hand to quiet the applause. He took a sip of his champagne, preparing for the pivot. "Surviving a tragedy forces a family to look toward the future," he said, his tone shifting from sentimental to sharp corporate optimism. "It forces us to think about legacy." As many of you know, my late father-in-law, Thomas Miller, was a pioneer of the Homer coastline. He owned a sprawling, beautiful piece of this great state. He was a man of the old world, but he always believed in progress. He gestured toward the men seated across from me. That is why I am thrilled to introduce Richard Vance and his development team from Seattle, my father announced. The Anchorage crowd murmured with sudden, eager approval. The room was filled with investors who recognized the lucrative potential of out-of-state capital pouring into the Kenai Peninsula. We have entered into a joint family venture to transform the Miller coastal property into a premier luxury resort. David continued, "It is a project that will bring immense value to our state and ensure our family legacy endures for generations. But a project of this magnitude requires dedicated focused corporate experience and an understanding of complex real estate logistics." He turned his body fully toward me. The warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a hard, demanding expectation. "Emily has always dedicated her life to the simple things," he said, offering a patronizing chuckle that the crowd softly echoed. "She is a wildlife rehabilitator with a huge heart. She knows that managing a massive commercial development is not her calling. She has graciously agreed to pass the torch, allowing the experienced members of this family to guide the estate into the future." He reached into his tailored jacket. He pulled out the crisp, heavy stock paper. He laid the proxy waiver flat on the pristine white tablecloth, positioning it directly over my empty dessert plate. He unscrewed the cap of the gold fountain pen and laid it carefully beside the signature line. "This document officially authorizes our family firm to execute the land transfer on her behalf," my father said to the room. "It seals our future." The ballroom erupted into another round of applause, louder this time. The guests clapped for the seamless transition of wealth, celebrating my supposed sacrifice. My father stood there beaming at his peers. The Seattle developers leaned forward in their chairs, their eyes locked on the pen. Brad wiped a bead of sweat from his forehead, desperate for the ink to hit the page so his debts could be erased. The applause slowly died down, leaving a heavy, expectant silence in its wake. The string quartet was quiet. The waitstaff stood still near the walls. 200 pairs of eyes were pinned on my hands. My father looked down at me. His smile was fixed in place, but his jaw was tight. "Sign it, Emily." He whispered, his voice a low, threatening hiss masked by his frozen grin. I looked at the gold pen resting on the white linen. I looked at the fraudulent contract designed to strip away the armor my grandfather had built for me. I felt the gaze of the corporate executives waiting to take my land. I felt the arrogant certainty of the family that had left me to die. I reached out and picked up the pen. The gold fountain pen rested on the crisp white tablecloth inches from my hand. The weight of 200 expectant stares pressed against me. The silence in the Turn-Again Country Club ballroom was absolute, save for the distant muffled clatter of dishes from the catering kitchen. My father stood beside me, his chest puffed out, radiating the smug certainty of a man who believed he had executed a flawless manipulation. The Seattle developers leaned forward, their eyes tracking the pen, eager to finalize the acquisition that would secure their luxury resort. I did not reach for the pen. Instead, I reached for my carbon fiber cane. I placed the rubber tip firmly against the hardwood floor and used it to push myself up. The sudden movement sent a sharp ache radiating up my braced leg, but I ignored it. I stood tall, the emerald green fabric of my dress catching the light of the crystal chandeliers. The collective breath of the room seemed to catch. My sudden verticality broke the script my father had so carefully written. I looked directly at Richard Vance, the lead developer from Seattle. I did not look at my father. I did not look at my mother, whose fake smile was already beginning to tremble. "I think there has been a significant misunderstanding here tonight," I said. My voice was calm, steady, and loud enough to carry past the head table. "I am not signing this document." My father's smile froze. The blood drained from his face so quickly he appeared suddenly ill. The corporate executives across the table exchanged sharp, confused glances. Brad, my brother-in-law, let out a choked, panicked noise, gripping his Scotch glass as if it were a life preserver. "Emily," my father hissed, leaning in close. His voice dropping to a harsh, threatening whisper meant only for me. "Sit down. Do not make a scene. You promised you would take care of the family." I turned my head to look at him. His eyes were wide with a terror he could no longer hide. "I am taking care of the family, Dad," I replied softly. "I am making sure you get exactly what you deserve." I turned back to the crowd. Before my father could grab my arm or attempt to physically force me back into my chair, the heavy oak double doors at the entrance of the ballroom swung open with a resounding thud. The string quartet, who had been resting their instruments, jumped in surprise. The guests nearest the entrance turned around, their murmurs of confusion quickly rippling through the massive room. Victoria Croft stood in the doorway. She did not wear an evening gown. She wore a sharp charcoal gray suit that cut through the soft pastel elegance of the country club like a scalpel. She carried her signature leather briefcase. Flanking her were two individuals. One was a tall man carrying a thick stack of manila folders. The other was a woman wearing a modest blazer, holding a digital notary seal. Victoria did not wait for an invitation. She walked down the center aisle of the ballroom with the relentless, unyielding momentum of a glacier. The crowd parted for her, sensing the immense, dangerous authority she projected. David tracked her progress across the room. His mouth opened, but no sound emerged. He recognized the threat, but his mind could not process the velocity at which his empire was collapsing. Victoria stopped 10 feet from the head table. She did not look at the Seattle developers. She did not look at the private equity investor. She fixed her gaze entirely on my father. "David Garcia," Victoria announced. Her voice did not require a microphone. It possessed a natural commanding acoustics that filled every corner of the silent ballroom. "I am Victoria Croft, managing partner of Croft & Associates and the appointed legal trustee for the Thomas Miller estate." The word trustee landed like a physical blow. Richard Vance sat up straighter, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed this sudden legal intervention. "You are currently attempting to solicit a signature for a proxy waiver regarding property located on the Homer coastline." Victoria continued, her tone clinical and devastating. "That property does not belong to you. It does not belong to your wife. It has not belonged to any individual person for over 5 years. My father swallowed hard. His hands shook as he grasped the edge of the table. "Ms. Croft, this is a private family event. We are handling an internal administrative matter." "You are handling nothing," Victoria countered, taking a step closer. "The land you are attempting to leverage is held within an irrevocable trust. Emily Garcia is the sole named beneficiary. Any attempt to transfer, sell, or encumber that acreage without my explicit notarized authorization is legally impossible." She gestured to the man standing beside her. He stepped forward and placed a heavy manila folder directly in front of Richard Vance. "Mr. Vance," Victoria said, turning her attention to the lead developer. "Inside that folder, you will find the certified deed for the 400 acres in Homer, firmly recorded under the trust. You will also find a cease and desist order regarding any further commercial development plans on that specific parcel of land." Richard Vance opened the folder. He scanned the documents with rapid, practiced efficiency. The color rose in his cheeks. He looked up, his eyes locking onto my father with a cold, corporate fury. David Vance said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You signed a letter of intent last week. You guaranteed you held a clear, unencumbered title to this property." My father raised his hands, a desperate, placating gesture. "Richard, please, there is just a minor clerical delay with the probate courts. We can resolve this. Emily is just confused." "She is not confused, Mr. Garcia." Victoria interrupted, her voice slicing through his lies. "She is protected." Victoria opened her leather briefcase. She pulled out a single yellowed sheet of paper. It was the expired residential lease proxy my father had stolen from my old files. "You informed the developers that you possessed legal authority," Victoria stated, holding the document up for the room to see. This morning, you attempted to submit this document to the county clerk office in Homer to fast-track a deed transfer. You altered the date. You attempted to repurpose a defunct residential lease agreement to bypass an irrevocable trust. The private equity investor sitting near Brad stood up abruptly. His chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. He did not need to hear another word. The collateral was fake. The investment was dead. In the state of Alaska, Victoria continued, her voice echoing with the finality of a gavel striking wood, utilizing an altered document to execute a commercial real estate transaction is a Class B felony. The county clerk office flagged your submission at 9 a.m. this morning. The document is currently under active review by the district attorney office for multiple counts of wire and real estate fraud. The ballroom erupted. The polite, wealthy silence shattered into a chaotic symphony of gasps, whispers, and harsh accusations. The socialites who had applauded my father moments ago were now staring at him as if he were carrying a highly contagious disease. Richard Vance threw the manila folder onto the table. You took a $100,000 advance from my firm, David. You spent corporate funds secured by a fraudulent signature. My father stumbled backward, knocking over his champagne flute. The crystal shattered, sending the expensive liquid spilling across the white linen. He looked at Susan, who was covering her face with her hands, weeping genuine tears of profound social humiliation. He looked at Jessica, who was staring at Brad with raw, unfiltered terror, as the private equity investor leaned in to whisper something brutal into her husband's ear. I stood leaning on my cane, watching the destruction of the kingdom my family had built on lies. They had used my trauma to extract sympathy from this room. They had used my silence to construct a fake empire, and now the very audience they craved was watching them burn. Victoria stepped forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with me. She looked at my father, delivering the final, crushing blow. Mr. Vance will be contacting his legal counsel regarding the immediate return of the advance funds, Victoria told my father. The district attorney will be contacting you regarding the fraudulent filing, and I am formally notifying you that any further attempts to contact my client or interfere with the trust assets will result in immediate civil litigation. She turned to me. Are you ready to leave, Emily? I looked at my father one last time. He was completely broken, stripped of his pride, his wealth, and his social standing. He was left with nothing but the consequences of his own greed. Yes, I said, I am ready to go home. I walked out of the Turn Again Country Club, the tapping of my cane, masking the heavy silence that followed me. The cold Alaskan air felt sharp and clean against my face, a stark contrast to the suffocating heat of the ballroom. Victoria walked silently beside me, her expression unreadable. I climbed into the back of the waiting SUV, pulling the door shut on the ruins of my family. I did not look back. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. I learned the details over the next few days, pieced together from Victoria's brief updates and the increasingly frantic voicemails left on my blocked phone. My father, who had spent decades cultivating an image of unshakable authority, watched it evaporate in less than 5 minutes. The developers from Seattle did not waste time with civility. Richard Vance, furious at being humiliated in front of Anchorage's elite, cornered my father before he could even leave the country club. The demand was explicit. Vance wanted the $100,000 advance returned to his corporate account by 9 a.m. on Monday. If the funds were not wired, his legal team would file a formal complaint with the FBI for wire fraud, given the interstate nature of the transaction. My father, completely trapped, tried to offer collateral he no longer possessed, begging for an extension. Vance simply handed him a business card and walked away. The situation with Brad was equally disastrous. The private equity representative witnessing the collapse of the land deal that was supposed to secure Brad's loans did not wait for Monday. He pulled Brad aside in the country club lobby and delivered the death blow. The firm was calling in the entire loan immediately. Every asset Brad had leveraged, from the luxury vehicles to the high-end boutique Jessica ran, was now subject to immediate seizure. Jessica, realizing the full scope of their financial ruin, had a public meltdown in the country club parking lot. She screamed at Brad, blaming him for the debt, while my mother tried desperately to usher them into the SUV before anyone else could witness the spectacle. The family that had spent years meticulously curating their public image was now the subject of intense, gleeful gossip across the entire city. My father spent the next 48 hours frantically trying to secure a loan to repay Vance. He contacted every business associate, every friend he had hosted at his lavish dinner parties. But word spreads fast in Anchorage. The people he had tried to impress at the country club were now actively avoiding his calls. Nobody wanted to lend money to a man under active investigation for real estate fraud. By Monday morning, the deadline Vance had set expired. True to his word, Vance's legal team filed the complaint. The local district attorney, already reviewing the forged power of attorney my father had submitted to the Homer County clerk, consolidated the charges. My father was now facing a multi-count felony indictment. The desperation reached a fever pitch. Having exhausted every external option, my family turned their attention back to the only source of capital left: me. They could not call my phone, so they started calling Victoria's office incessantly. David left messages begging for a meeting, offering to publicly apologize, promising to make things right if I would just authorize a temporary loan from the trust. Susan left tearful voicemails appealing to my sense of family duty, reminding me of the times she had cared for me when I was a child. Jessica simply demanded her fair share, insisting that Grandfather Thomas would never have wanted her to lose her boutique. Victoria documented every call, building a comprehensive file of their harassment. She forwarded a select few to me, not to upset me, but to ensure I understood the reality of their desperation. They were not sorry for abandoning me in the hospital. They were sorry they got caught. They were sorry they were broke. On Wednesday afternoon, I was sitting on the back deck of the Homer cabin, watching the tide roll out. The physical therapy was grueling, but I could now stand for short periods without the brace. I was wearing an old flannel shirt of my grandfather's, the fabric soft and familiar. The coastal wind was biting, but I found comfort in its harsh reality. Victoria arrived unannounced. She stepped onto the deck, her briefcase in hand, her expression serious. "We need to discuss our final maneuver," she said, pulling a chair out and sitting across from me. "Your father is officially out of options. The banks have frozen his accounts pending the fraud investigation. Brad's cars were repossessed this morning. The boutique is locked, the inventory seized." I looked out at the water. I expected to feel a surge of triumph, a rush of vindication, but I only felt a profound, hollow exhaustion. The victory was complete, but the cost was the final, undeniable realization that the people who were supposed to love me only valued me as a resource. "He is going to try one last desperate play," Victoria continued, her voice pulling me back to the present. "He cannot access the trust legally, and he cannot intimidate you socially. His only remaining leverage is emotional manipulation. He will try to bypass me and reach you directly." How I asked. "They do not know the security gate code, and the private nurses are under strict orders not to let anyone on the property." Victoria placed a thick manila folder on the wooden table. "Because he is not going to come here. He is going to force you to come to him." She opened the folder and pushed a document toward me. It was a formal legal notice drafted by a bottom-tier law firm my father had likely hired on contingency. "He has filed a petition for emergency conservatorship," Victoria explained, her tone laced with professional disgust. "He is claiming that your traumatic brain injury from the accident has rendered you mentally incompetent to manage your affairs. He is arguing that I manipulated you into the trust arrangement while you were vulnerable, and he is petitioning the court to grant him full control of your medical and financial decisions." My blood ran cold. The sheer audacity of the move was staggering. He was not just trying to steal my money. He was trying to steal my autonomy. He wanted to legally declare me incompetent so he could take the reins of the estate and use the funds to pay off his fraudulent debts. "It is a baseless claim," Victoria assured me quickly. "We have extensive medical records from your private care team documenting your complete cognitive recovery. The petition will not survive a preliminary hearing." "Then why did he file it?" I asked, my hands shaking slightly as I gripped the arms of my chair. Because a conservatorship hearing requires the proposed ward to be present, Victoria said softly. He is using the court system to force a face-to-face confrontation. He knows he cannot win the legal argument, but he believes he can break you emotionally if he gets you in a room. He thinks if he cries, if your mother begs, you will fold and sign a settlement just to make it stop. The court date is set for next Tuesday, Victoria added. In Anchorage. I leaned back in my chair, closing my eyes against the cold wind. My father was a cornered animal lashing out with everything he had left. He was willing to publicly declare his daughter mentally unfit just to save his own skin. He had weaponized my coma. He had weaponized his social standing. And now he was weaponizing the legal system. I will be there, I told Victoria, opening my eyes. I will not hide down here while he tries to paint me as a helpless victim. Victoria nodded, her expression hardening with resolve. Good. Because we are not just going to defeat this petition, Emily. We are going to counterfile. She pulled another document from her briefcase. If your father wants to play games with the legal system, we will oblige him, she said. I have drafted a comprehensive civil suit against David and Susan Garcia and Brad and Jessica Miller. We are suing them for intentional infliction of emotional distress, attempted fraud, and gross negligence regarding your medical care. I stared at the paperwork. The countersuit was not about the money. It was about creating a public, undeniable record of their actions. It was about forcing them to answer for the 12 days they left me alone in that hospital bed. We will serve them. The papers in the courtroom, Victoria stated. Let them explain to a judge why they abandoned their daughter while trying to steal her inheritance. The final confrontation was set. The stage was no longer a country club ballroom filled with easily impressed socialites. It was a courtroom where facts, evidence, and the brutal truth would dictate the outcome. My father thought he was forcing my hand. He did not realize he was scheduling his own execution. The legal confrontation set the stage for a rapid and uncompromising financial collapse. The following weeks unfolded not with dramatic shouting matches, but with the cold, methodical dismantling of the empire my parents had spent decades trying to build. I monitored the fallout from the quiet safety of the Homer cabin. The physical distance provided clarity, allowing me to watch the dominoes fall without being crushed beneath them. The most immediate and devastating blow landed squarely on my father. The developers from Seattle were not bluffing. Richard Vance's legal team filed the formal wire fraud complaint, and the district attorney in Homer proceeded with the indictment for the forged power of attorney. To avoid a drawn-out criminal trial and the very real threat of federal prison, my father entered a desperate plea negotiation. The central condition of that negotiation was the immediate restitution of the $100,000 advance. But David Garcia did not have $100,000. He had spent his final liquid assets trying to impress the Anchorage elite at the Turnagain Country Club. With his bank accounts frozen pending the fraud investigation and his professional reputation destroyed, traditional lenders refused to engage with him. The men he used to golf with would not return his calls. He was a toxic asset. To secure the funds and avoid prison, David and Susan were forced to turn to high-interest predatory lenders. They took out a brutal second mortgage on their pristine Anchorage home, accepting terms that effectively guaranteed they would never own the property outright again. The house that had served as the physical symbol of their success was now a financial anchor dragging them underwater. The collapse of David's stability triggered an immediate chain reaction for Jessica and Brad. Brad's private equity investors, realizing the collateral was non-existent, did not just call in the loan. They initiated an aggressive asset seizure protocol. The luxury vehicles Brad leased were repossessed from the driveway of his suburban home. His commercial development startup, built entirely on leveraged debt and false promises, filed for total bankruptcy. The corporate shell dissolved, leaving Brad personally liable for the remaining deficits. Jessica's high-end boutique. The vanity project my parents had subsidized for years was the next casualty. Without the constant influx of cash from David, she could not meet payroll or cover the exorbitant rent in the prime retail district. The creditors arrived unannounced on a Tuesday morning. They changed the locks on the velvet-lined doors and seized the imported wool coats and designer inventory. Jessica was left standing on the sidewalk, holding a cup of complimentary espresso, watching her curated identity disappear into moving trucks. The social fallout was just as severe as the financial ruin. In Anchorage's upper middle-class circles, wealth is a shield, but the appearance of wealth is fragile. The public execution at the country club had exposed my family as frauds. Susan was quietly removed from the board of her charitable foundation. Jessica's friends, the women who used to frequent her boutique, suddenly became unavailable for lunch dates. The family was ostracized, isolated in a city where they had once commanded respect. As the reality of their situation settled in, the desperation shifted focus. Having exhausted every legal and financial avenue, they turned their attention back to the Homer coastline. They turned their attention back to me. The court date for the emergency conservatorship petition arrived. I traveled to Anchorage with Victoria Croft, walking into the courtroom under my own power, using only a simple cane. My father sat at the petitioner's table looking 10 years older. His expensive suit hung loosely on his frame. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, terrified desperation. The hearing lasted less than 20 minutes. Victoria presented the comprehensive medical evaluations from my private care team, documenting my full cognitive and physical recovery. The judge dismissed my father's petition with prejudice, issuing a stern warning about the frivolous use of the court system to resolve financial disputes. But Victoria was not finished. Before my father could leave the courtroom, she served him with the civil suit. We sued them for intentional infliction of emotional distress and gross negligence. We did not ask for a massive financial settlement, knowing they had nothing left to give. We asked for a permanent, legally binding restraining order. We asked the court to mandate that David, Susan, Jessica, and Brad cease all contact with me and remain off the Homer property indefinitely. The judge, having reviewed the evidence of the forged documents and the hospital abandonment, granted the request without hesitation. The legal barrier was impenetrable, but the emotional assault continued. They could not approach me physically, so they resorted to digital bombardment. They acquired prepaid cell phones to bypass the blocks Victoria had instituted. One evening, while sitting by the wood stove in the cabin, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. A few minutes later, the notification icon appeared. I pressed play, listening to the audio file fill the quiet room. It was my mother. Susan was weeping, the sound raw and unfamiliar. "Emily, please," her voice cracked. "Please just pick up the phone. We are losing everything. The bank is foreclosing on the house. Brad has filed for bankruptcy. We don't have anywhere to go. We are your family. You have $3.5 million just sitting there. You don't need all of it. Just a fraction of it could save us. Please, sweetheart. We made a mistake. We were scared. Just call me back." The voicemail ended. A second one followed immediately, this time from Jessica. She was not crying. She sounded frantic, her words tumbling over each other. "You are ruining our lives, Emily," she accused, the manipulation bleeding through the desperation. "You are sitting down there in Grandpa's cabin while we are losing our homes. How can you be so selfish? How can you sleep at night knowing your sister is going to be on the street? If you don't authorize a transfer by tomorrow, I am going to." I deleted the message before she could finish the threat. I sat in the quiet cabin, the fire crackling in the stove. I listened to the wind howling against the timber walls. The old Emily, the naive wildlife girl, would have felt a crushing sense of guilt. She would have internalized their panic and viewed it as her responsibility to fix. She would have authorized the transfer, setting herself on fire to keep them warm. But I had spent 12 days in a coma while they complained about parking fees. I had watched them attempt to steal my grandfather's legacy and declare me mentally incompetent to cover their tracks. I opened the contact settings on my phone. I blocked the new numbers. I cleared the voicemail inbox. I did not feel guilt. I felt a profound, clarifying emptiness. The money in the trust was not a weapon, but it was a shield. I refused to lower it for the people who had tried to destroy me. They had built their kingdom on leveraged debt and calculated cruelty. Now the foundation had cracked and the walls were coming down. I was not going to stand in the rubble and hand them the bricks to rebuild. They were going to have to survive the cold on their own. 14 months have passed since I woke up in that sterile hospital room. The Alaskan summer arrived with long days of bright sunlight stretching late into the evening. I stood on the edge of Kachemak Bay, feeling the cold ocean water wash over the toes of my waterproof boots. My heavy leg brace was gone. My carbon fiber walking cane was packed away in a closet. I walked across the shifting stones of the beach without a single trace of a limp. The air smelled of spruce needles and churning salt water. The timber cabin my grandfather built stood behind me, weathering the coastal winds just as it had for 40 years. But the property around it had transformed into something extraordinary. Where Brad had once hammered wooden stakes into the frozen earth to map out a luxury marina, a towering flight enclosure now stood. It was constructed from heavy-gauge steel and reinforced mesh 50 feet high and spanning half an acre of the coastal tree line. Inside the enclosure, a pair of rehabilitated bald eagles stretched their broad wings, building the muscle strength required for their imminent release. I used a fraction of the liquid capital from the trust to build the Thomas Miller Avian Sanctuary. We employed a full-time staff of avian veterinarians, rescue coordinators, and marine biologists. We did not pave the land to build a resort. We protected the soil. We expanded the natural habitat. We created a state-of-the-art medical facility dedicated to nursing broken animals back to health. The gravel driveway crunched under the tires of a familiar vehicle. Victoria Croft stepped out of her sleek black town car. She wore a sharp navy blue suit, her signature leather briefcase gripped firmly in her hand. She walked down the pebble beach to meet me. We did not just share an attorney and client relationship anymore. We shared a mutual respect forged in the fires of a brutal legal victory. Victoria handled the trust finances with a clinical precision that generated consistent, impressive returns. She opened her briefcase and handed me a printed prospectus. The Trust Investment Division had recently acquired a portfolio of distressed commercial real estate in downtown Anchorage. The bank had bundled several foreclosed retail spaces and auctioned them at a steep discount. I scanned the list of addresses printed on the crisp white paper. One specific street number caught my eye. I read it twice to ensure my mind was not playing tricks on me. It was the address of the high-end outerwear boutique my sister Jessica used to own. It was the same retail space my parents had drained their savings to keep afloat for years. The bank had gutted the interior after the bankruptcy proceedings. Victoria looked at me with a quiet, knowing expression. She explained that the trust needed a centralized administrative office in the city to coordinate fundraising efforts and manage our educational outreach programs. The commercial real estate bundle was a smart financial acquisition, but this specific building offered a unique opportunity. She asked me how I wanted to redesign the space. I pictured the velvet seating areas and the crystal espresso machines being ripped out of the walls. I pictured the pretentious elitist atmosphere my family cultivated being swept into a dumpster. I told Victoria to replace the imported Italian tile with durable laminate flooring. I told her to knock down the expensive designer dressing rooms and build an interactive classroom. We were going to invite local public school children into that space to learn about Alaskan wildlife conservation and environmental science. We were going to turn the ultimate symbol of my family and their superficial vanity into a space dedicated to the very career they used to mock. It was a clean, legally ironclad transfer of purpose. Victoria smiled, made a note in her file, and closed her briefcase. My parents did not recover from their financial collapse. Anchorage society possesses a very short memory for people who run out of money. David and Susan were forced to move into a cramped two-bedroom rental on the industrial outskirts of the city. My father, who once stood in a ballroom and demanded the attention of corporate executives, had to take a retail management job at a local hardware store to satisfy the terms of his debt restructuring. Susan took a job answering phones at a dental clinic. Brad and Jessica divorced 6 months after the private equity firm seized their assets. Without the illusion of wealth to bind them together, their marriage dissolved into bitter public accusations. Jessica was currently working as a shift supervisor at a commercial coffee chain in a strip mall. They lived less than 3 hours away, but they existed in an entirely different universe. The permanent restraining order Victoria secured remained in full effect. My phone never rang with their numbers. The silence they forced upon me when they walked out of that hospital unit was now the boundary that protected my peace. I did not feel pity for them. They engineered their own destruction through greed and arrogance. I just let them face the consequences of their own actions. Family is a word people use to excuse a lot of cruelty. Society tells us that blood is an unbreakable bond, a mandatory obligation that overrides our own survival instincts. People will tell you that you have to forgive your parents because they gave you life. They will tell you to ignore the betrayal because holding on to anger is toxic. But love is not defined by shared genetics. Love is an action. It is holding someone's hand when they are broken. It is sitting in a hospital room waiting for a girl to wake up from a coma. It is building a financial fortress for a granddaughter you know will be thrown to the wolves the moment you take your last breath. Thomas Miller saw the wolves circling years before I ever understood the danger. He watched my parents measure the value of a life by the balance of a checking account. He reached out from beyond the grave and handed me the sword I needed to defend myself. I did not win a war against my family. I simply refused to be a casualty. Sometimes the trash takes itself out, but sometimes you just have to hand them the bag and watch them climb in. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic family? Tell me below. Subscribe for more.